There's a really well-known quote from the Methodist minister John Wesley that goes something like this: "Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as you ever can." Now, there's a slight problem with this quote, and that's the fact that Wesley never actually said it, but you can understand why this quote has persisted. It gets at a really fundamental and intuitive idea about what a good life looks like. It's the idea that we can both quantify how much good that we're doing in our individual actions, and that we should try to maximize the amount of good that we're doing over the course of our lives. And this idea that the right action is the one that will create the most good consequences is the central idea behind one of the most important moral philosophies of the last couple hundred years: utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism comes to us mostly from two British philosophers in the 19th century, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Now, Bentham and Mill were not just moral philosophers, they were also social reformers. Bentham was one of the early founders of University College London. John Stuart Mill was a member of the British Parliament, and they both fought for things like equal rights, civil rights, women's rights, and were actually early proponents of gay rights. Utilitarianism was an idea that they came up with because they wanted to create a moral philosophy that was, in their view, scientific. They wanted a moral philosophy where we could actually go out in the world and measure the amount of goodness that was being created, and be able to, just like a scientist would go out and measure the amount of green on the trees or the number of elephants on the savannah, be able to measure the amount of goodness in the world and try to figure out how to be able to then maximize that goodness. And so really at the end of the day, utilitarianism is just a very basic math equation. We have this thing that we call utility. Utility is just the consequences of the action that are performed. If you do good things and you create good consequences, this is usually called positive utility. And if you do bad things that create negative consequences, then you create negative utility. And really all that we have to do to figure out whether or not an action is good or how good an action is to look at the consequences of the action. We look at all of the positive consequences of the action and we add them up. And then we look at all of the negative consequences of the action and then we subtract them. And then we're left with this thing called the net utility. And really, that's the entire theory at a very basic level. And if that's the case, you can understand why this is such an intuitive and appealing theory. For one thing, the idea that really what we should be interested in doing is creating as much good as possible in the world is an incredibly intuitive one. And being able to say that, we just want to measure the amount of good that's being done, and whatever creates the most net utility is the thing that is the best action to perform, also seems really intuitive at a very basic level. There's another really wonderful, intuitive idea behind utilitarianism that makes it appealing, and that's the idea of the moral community. Now, there are some moral philosophies, like deontology, for example, that struggle to explain things like how we should treat infants, or how we should treat people who are in unrecoverable comas, or who have suffered from cognitive decline, or how we should treat non-human animals, for example. Utilitarianism doesn't have this problem because it's not worried about whether or not you can reason or whether or not you meet some sort of cognitive threshold to be a member of the moral community. What the utilitarian is really concerned about is simply whether or not you can experience consequences, whether those consequences are good or bad. In fact, as Jeremy Bentham, one of the founders of utilitarianism, said, the question is not, can they reason? Nor, can they talk? But, can they suffer? And this is, again, a really intuitive idea. It's wrong, we think, to drown puppies in the river for funsies, not because the puppies have any sort of rational capabilities that we should take seriously, but because that would cause a lot of pain, and pain is a negative consequence, and those are negative consequences that we can and should avoid. By the same token, it's wrong to throw babies from the rooftops, not because babies will someday be rational creatures, but because babies will experience a lot of pain when they hit the ground, and their parents will be very upset when they find out what's happened, and these are things that we should avoid. Now, if this is the case, you may be asking yourself, well, why aren't we just all utilitarians? Why isn't this a series of videos about how to be a good utilitarian, for example? And it turns out there are some problems, or at least potential problems, with utilitarianism that we should take seriously. The first one that we should think about is this. Utilitarianism is a really wonderful theory in theory, but in practice, it's actually very hard to implement. As the baseball player and philosopher Yogi Berra once said, theory and practice are the same in theory. In practice, they're different. And if you think about this, it's really easy to say, well, we're just going to add up all the good consequences and subtract all the bad consequences and then be left with the rightness or wrongness of the action. But how are we going to measure that? How much goodness precisely is created by donating $5 to the local food bank? How much badness is created by grading an exam particularly harshly? And that's just for straightforward questions of measurement. There are also questions about, how we measure or how we compare things that seem very, very different. For example, it seems like there are a lot of really good consequences with getting a college education. There are also really good consequences with good sex. Good sex feels really good. A good education will help me do things like get a job and so on and so forth. It will make me be educated, which is presumably a good thing. So, okay, which is better, a good education or good sex? It's kind of hard to tell because they're such different things. And if utilitarianism is going to work, we actually need some kind of theory that's going to be able to allow us to compare those things to each other. Another potential problem with utilitarianism is this. It's the idea that it's incredibly, incredibly demanding. So if we want to maximize the amount of good that we're doing in the world, that means a very specific thing. We should maximize the amount of good that we're doing in the world. If I can give $10 to charity, that's wonderful. But it would be better if I could give $100 to charity. Maybe it would be better still if I could give $1,000 to charity or $10,000 to charity. And if that's the case, we have to ask ourselves, what's actually the morally right thing to do? And if the answer is the thing that would create the most utility, it seems like the thing that I am morally obligated to do is in fact to give the $10,000 to charity. And a lot of times we think that there's sort of a limit on what we're asked to do, morally speaking. There's a point at which we could do more, but we're not actually obligated to do so. I might actually have an obligation to give some of my money to charity, but it's not at least immediately obvious that I have an obligation to give almost all of my money to charity, or so much money to charity that I would suddenly find myself with substantially reduced living conditions. There's a third problem with utilitarianism that's also worth taking very seriously, and that's this. The utilitarian, at the end of the day, simply does not care about rights. The deontologist really cares about rights. The deontologist cares about your right to life, your right to free speech, your right to be represented by the government, so on and so forth. The utilitarian simply doesn't. Rights aren't the kind of thing that are compatible with utilitarianism, because sometimes respecting people's rights might actually end up reducing utility. For example, there may be somebody who committed a crime and it seems pretty obvious that they actually committed it. And there may be a case where, the people in the city where the crime was committed are demanding justice. And the right thing to do from a utilitarian perspective might be to act very swiftly and not give this person the right to a fair trial because it's so obvious that they actually committed the crime. But the right to a fair trial seems, for example, very, very important, even if it will ultimately reduce the amount of utility by taking longer or having the possibility that this person could be found not guilty even though they clearly did it, so on and so forth. The utilitarian at best is going to be able to say, well, we should probably respect people's rights most of the time, because respecting people's rights most of the time will actually create a lot of happiness, will create a lot of good consequences. But that's a very different thing from saying we actually should respect people's rights at all times. And if you're concerned about people's rights, that's a really tough circle to square from a utilitarian perspective. So ultimately, at the end of the day, what are we left with? We're left with, honestly, a very compelling theory. We're left with a theory that has a very intuitive idea behind it. We should want to create the most goodness in the world, and the actions that we should carry out are those actions that will actually create that goodness. Does that mean that we should ultimately accept the theory? Well, maybe, maybe not. There are at least some things that we need to be aware of, that we need to think further about before we do. Questions about how we do actually measure utility. Questions about what utilitarianism actually asks of us. Questions about whether or not we should really be concerned about rights. But ultimately, it's a theory that's worth taking seriously. It's a theory that tells us important things about the nature of goodness, the nature of the right action. Things like we should, at some level, probably be concerned about the consequences of our actions, for example. But it's not the only theory on offer. We'll continue looking at other theories in other videos, and I hope to do that with you very soon. Okay, so I'm sitting here and I realized as I'm editing the video, I totally forgot to tell you like the craziest thing about Jeremy Bentham, and that's this. When he died, he actually had his body stuffed and mummified, and you can go visit him at University College London, where he is kept in a thing called the auto icon. A couple things you should know about this if you do. Number one, if you go and see it, that's not actually his head. His head got really messed up in the embalming process. His like actual head used to be kept at his feet inside the auto icon, but like students from a neighboring college kept stealing it as a prank. And also this, the auto icon has wheels and you can wheel Jeremy Bentham around. In fact, he is frequently wheeled into board meetings at University College London, where he is traditionally listed as present but not voting, except Bentham actually breaks ties. Anytime there's a tie on the board of directors at University College London, Bentham always casts the tie-breaking vote in support of whatever resolution is being offered. So, weird facts about really weird and interesting philosophers.